Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Um, Tonight's class is in the merit of all our brothers and sisters in the land of Israel, those on the front lines, those who are not on the front lines, who need our protection, who need healing, who need to be rescued, and of course, and all the Jewish people, wherever they may be, who need divine protection. If you would like to sponsor a class, sponsorships are available. Please send us a message. You could put your name in the comments, and we would be happy to help you to, sponsor a class. Tonight, we are going to deviate from the Torah portion. We're going to focus a little bit on what's going on in the world and talk about what is the proper response of the Jewish people in the current situation that we are in. So to start off, we're going to start off with a story. The story is about a famous Hasidic expression, and this will be kind of the key to tonight's class. In the Chabad Yeshiva, the Lubavitch Yeshiva, in the city of Lubavitch in White Russia, called Tamchei Tamimim, there was a older Chassid there who was one of the teachers in the yeshiva. His name was Rabbi Michal. And many of the previous generation Hasidic rabbis knew him from their time in the yeshiva. The yeshiva was founded in the year 1897. So for context, so he was probably there from the beginning of that time. When he was a young man, one of his children, I believe he was his only child, became very ill. I'm not sure if he was his only child, but one of his children became very ill. And so the other Hasidim in his town told him, you got to go to Lubavitch, to the Rebbe in Lubavitch, and ask for a blessing in the town of Lubavitch. So they told him, the doctors were telling him, like, this is it, this is the end. You shouldn't be going anywhere. But the other Hasidim told him, you must ask. God will not prevent you from asking for mercy, and certainly the best place to ask for mercy is to go to the Rebbe. So he goes on a short trip, whatever the town, however far it was. At the time, the Rebbe was the third Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Lubavitch, known as the Tzemach Tzedek. And he shows up, and immediately, he's able to hitchhike a little bit and get some rides. So it took quicker than if you would have, just walked, as was the custom back in the days. They literally walked, from town to town. They weren't very wealthy in White Russia. At any rate, he's able to Lubavitch. He's able to get an audience with the Rebbe, and he says, and he gives in his note, has the name of his son, and asking for a blessing that he should, that the Rebbe should pray to God and he should feel recover. And as soon as he gives him the note, it crosses his mind, this Reb Michal, that who knows what's going on at home. He left an ill child at home, and who knows what's going on. Maybe it's already, God forbid, it's all over. And he bursts into tears. And the Rebbe reads his note, and he tells him, don't worry, think good, it'll be good. In the original Yiddish, trach gut wird sein gut. Think good and it will be good. And he said, you will be at the bar mitzvahs of your grandchildren. And so it was. He thought better, he thought good thoughts, and his child recovered. And he never had an easy life, but whenever he had problems with his children, his family, whatever it was, he always thought back to that moment that the Rebbe told him, think good, it will be good. And whenever he would feel better and things would improve. That's the story of how this Hasidic saying, think good and it will be good, came about, was from this story. So the question always was, what's the it's a nice saying, what is the theology, philosophy of this saying? What is the source of such a comment? So if we look, the original one, we'll bring two sources, one from the Jewish mysticism and one from the Talmud. So in the Zohar, it says that the world reflects, is kind of like a reflection, and everything in heaven is a reflection of us. So if we are sad, then the heavens are sad. If we are joyous, then the heavens are joyous. So we see here in the Zohar this idea that our heaven actually reflects our attitudes and the way we behave. So therefore, if we think good, then in heaven it reflects in a positive way. And in fact, in the correspondence of the Tzemach Tzedek, of the third Chabad Rebbe, who is this story is attributed to, and the saying, we find it in his correspondence. We find this idea, and another story. The story was at the end of his grandfather's life, that Tzemach Tzedek's grandfather. His grandfather was the first Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. They were running away from Napoleon's invasion into Russia, and they ended up just a small group. The Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, his grandson, the Tzemach Tzedek, who we are talking about tonight, and a few other Hasidim ended up on a road middle of January, deep into what is today Ukraine, and the Alter Rebbe ended up passing away during this trip, and he is buried till today in Ukraine in a city called Hadich. He actually passed away in a city called Piena, which is a few kilometers away from Hadich, but there were literally no Jews in the city of Piena, and therefore it did not have a Jewish cemetery, so they ended up having to move him and bury him in Hadich. And they ended up, when they came to Piena, this little tiny town, they were so desperate. It was so cold in January, in the middle of Ukraine, Russia at the time, and not having any provisions or anywhere to stay, they ended up staying in like a barn or a warehouse of some non-Jew, peasant. And it was and Alter Rebbe was sick and he was passing away. And so a few days before he passed away, I think it was actually the day before he passed away, that Tzemach Tzedek was doing his prayers and doing the evening prayer, and he was singing the prayer in a very melancholy tune, because it was a very melancholy situation. And he waited for him to finish, and the Alter Rebbe waited for his grandson, the Tzemach Tzedek, to finish, and he told him that his teacher, the Maggid of Mizrich, would say, it says in the verse, on the likeness of the throne was the likeness of a man above it. And essentially saying that what we showed down below is reflected above. And therefore, his melancholy prayer was affecting, so to speak, melancholy in the upper realms, in the heavens. And therefore, so it wasn't appropriate at that time to sing in a melancholy way, even though it was a very tough situation. And in this letter, the Tzemach Tzedek continues talking to somebody who had written to him about obviously a very disturbing situation that he was going through. So the Tzemach Tzedek says to him, and I'll read part of this letter, that there are fears that people cause themselves, and there are fears that people have a choice and ability to prevent, as follows. It says in the Torah about war, it says, Al Yerach Levavchem, you are not to do not let your heart be afraid. So the question is, what do you mean don't let your heart be afraid? Fear is a reaction to something that's going on. And if the Torah is telling us that you cannot be afraid, that means we must have a choice in the matter. Everything that the Torah tells us, we have a choice. We have a choice. We could do it. We cannot do it. The Torah doesn't tell us to do things that are out of our control. The Torah doesn't tell us the weather has to be a certain way, because right, we can't control the weather. So obviously there must be this idea that we should not fear. Must be that it's in our control. So how is that possible? It's possible by not focusing on the thing that brings fear. And we have to focus on things that bring us happiness, whether it be mundane matters or obviously spiritual matters. Like it says, the Torah gladdens the heart. In fact, in Jewish law, when it talks about the laws of somebody who's in mourning, one of the things that a mourner is not allowed to do is study Torah, because it brings joy, it brings gladness of the heart. So we see here that by focusing on, going back to our conversation, by focusing on good things, by focusing on things that are happy, we won't become depressed, we won't become sad. And therefore, it is in our control not to be afraid. It is in our control not to become fearful of whatever situation we may be in, whether it's personally or as a nation. And therefore, the Tzemach Tzedek gives the advice to this person that you should not discuss depressing things and act completely happy. And even if you don't feel it now, you will ultimately become happy, because the heart follows a person's deeds, right? If you are involved in certain things, then you will feel that way. In the common parlance, we say "fake it till you make it," right? But it's not really faking it. We're saying do the things that make you happy. Be involved in the things that, and then if you repeatedly do those things, eventually you will become happy. Not fake it till you make it, but rather by being in that mode, you will actually become that person. And Maimonides talks about this in his law, in his code of Jewish law, that if you want to have certain character traits, positive character traits, what is the way to do that? Is by constantly performing those things that people of those character traits do, and then you will become that person. So that is the way that you can be happy. So that is one source for this idea in the Zohar in Jewish mysticism. Now we're going to talk about a source that's brought in the Talmud, specifically focusing on a verse in the Torah. So there's a story in the Torah about Moses, one of the first stories that we encounter Moses as an adult. Moses grows up in the house of Pharaoh. We all know the story. And he leaves the palace, and he goes out to see his Jewish brethren, and he encounters a man who is beating a Jew, an Egyptian taskmaster who is beating a Jew. And it says that Moses looks here and there, and he kills the Egyptian, and he hides him in the sand. And that is the first part of the story. The second part of the story is, the next day, he's walking around, and he sees two Jews fighting. And Moses says, why are you hitting your fellow Jew? And the response that Moses gets from these two people who were fighting actually were the famous troublemakers, Dasan and Aviram, who continue to make trouble throughout the desert until they end up dying in the part of Korach's rebellion. But that's a whole other conversation. They're like the kind of the antagonist throughout the story. And Moses says to them, why are you hitting your fellow Jew? And he says, well, what, are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptians? So Torah says, Moses realizes that the word is getting out, and eventually Pharaoh hears about it, and Moses has to flee and go to Midian, where he ends up meeting his wife. He ends up encountering the burning bush, etc. So Rashi comments on that story as follows. Rashi says that on the verse that Moses became afraid that the word was getting out. And Rashi comments, first of all, the plain meaning. And then he says, homiletical teaching as well, that Moses saw that what was the fear? The fear was that the Jewish people were not worthy of redemption. They're fighting amongst each other. So the question is, why would Rashi have to say, the first explanation is simple. Moses became afraid. I mean, that's so obvious it doesn't even have to be said. He points out the obvious. It's one of those contradictions. If it's so obvious, why do you have to point it out? So why is Rashi saying the simple meaning that Moses became afraid? And we have to remember, Rashi's commentary. Rashi writes in his introduction to his commentary that he is only explaining the simple meaning of the verse for a 5-year-old to understand. So if a 5-year-old is reading, he understands. It's not so complicated. Moses was afraid because he had just killed an Egyptian, and now he finds out that people are finding out about it, and he's afraid that Pharaoh's going to hear it, and eventually that's what happens. So it's pretty obvious. You don't have to explain and say, no, it's the obvious thing is the obvious. So the one explanation we could give that fits with what we're trying to get through tonight is that the answer is that Moses not been afraid, had Moses thought had thought good, it would have been good. And Pharaoh, which that happens later, that Pharaoh hears, that would not have happened. But because Moses was afraid, that is what caused that. That is what caused that Pharaoh would find out, was the fact that Moses was afraid. And what Rashi is trying to teach us is that the simple meaning of the verse that Moses became afraid is that should Moses have thought positively, that wouldn't have happened. But because, and not only he was afraid, but he expressed his fear verbally, that is what caused this to happen. And we see this idea in the Talmud that it says that speaking ill about somebody else kills 3 people. So there, in the land of Israel, the Talmud tells us, in the land of Israel, they called Lashon Hara, speaking ill about others, they called it triple speech, because it killed 3. Who's it kill? It kills the person who is speaking, it hurts the person who is hearing it, and it also kills or hurts the one who is being spoke about. So what's the obvious question? If you tell me it hurts the person who's speaking, makes sense. He's doing something negative. If you tell me it hurts the person who's listening, makes sense. No one asked him to sit there and listen to something negative being spoken. But what about the third person? Why does it have to hurt him as well? And the answer is because speech has an effect. That everything that we say has an effect in the world, and not just thoughts alone, but speech. And the fact that we speak ill about somebody, it actually has an effect. And there's a story about the Baal Shem Tov. Talking a lot of stories tonight. There's a story about the Baal Shem Tov that one time in his synagogue in the town of Mezebush in Poland or Ukraine, there were 2 people having an argument, and one person yelled, "I'm going to shred you like a fish." And the Baal Shem Tov called his students over, and he asked them to all put their arms around each other, and they saw in a spiritual realm that actually this person was shredding the other person like a fish. In other words, the Baal Shem Tov was teaching his students that actually has an effect. The speech that one person has on another has an effect. So we see here this idea again brought not just in Jewish mysticism, but as well in the Talmud, this idea that speech, thoughts have an effect on someone else. And the same thing applies to not just negatively, but how much more so in a positive way. That speaking positive and positive attitudes and positive ideas has an effect on others, not just psychologically, but in reality. There's another thing that's brought down in the Medrash about the reasons why the Jewish people merited the redemption from Egypt. So the Talmud tells us the Medrash tells us there were 4 things that the Jewish people did uniquely that the Jewish people merited the redemption, which were: they didn't change their names, they didn't change their language, they didn't say evil speech, they didn't speak negatively about each other, and they didn't engage in immoral activity. So, and the Medrash continues explaining, what does it mean they didn't change their names? The Medrash says as follows: they descended to Egypt as Reuven and Shimon, and they came out of Egypt as Reuven and Shimon. So, and Rehuda was not called Rufa, and Reuven was not called Loyani, Yosef was not called Listius, and Binyamin was not called Alexandri. Those were, I guess, Egyptian names, and the Jewish people kept their names. So what does it mean that Reuven stayed Reuven and Shimon stayed Shimon? Well, if you say the Jewish people kept their names, then yeah, we know what Jewish names are. So, and we know the names of the Jewish people who left Egypt. We know the names of the Jewish people who came into Egypt. So why do you have to tell me that Reuven stayed Reuven? But really what we're saying is, what this Medrash is saying is that it's not just that Reuven stayed Reuven, but because Reuven came with the attitude that they are going to leave as Reuven, that itself is what gave them the ability to withstand the 210 years of exile. That they came with the attitude, I am Reuven, and they thought positively that I am going to leave as Reuven. And therefore, they did leave as Reuven. And I am Shimon, I am a Jewish person, I have a Jewish identity, and therefore, that confidence is what gave them the ability to have the redemption. So we see here again this idea that through positive thinking and positive attitudes can actually have an effect on the reality of the situation. The last example we'll talk about is something that happened exactly 50 years ago, the Yom Kippur War. And during the Yom Kippur War, the Rabbi spoke about the idea of keeping positive. And 3 days after the Yom Kippur War was a particularly tough day. The Jewish people were totally surprised by the attack and were unprepared, and it was a very difficult situation. And the Rebbe addressed the fact that 3 days after the Yom Kippur War, he held a Farbrengen, he held a Hasidic gathering, which obviously implies joy and everything that goes with that, saying L'chaim, being happy, sharing words of Torah in a positive way. And the Rebbe said, what am I doing here? I'm sitting here in the middle of in Brooklyn, and Jews are dying in the land of Israel. Jews are fighting for their lives, and we're sitting here being happy. Why are we doing that? So he quoted a teaching from the Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, a famous Hasidic Rebbe, and as follows. It says in the verse in Tehillim, it says in chapter 121, Hashem Tzilcha, God is your shadow. Essentially saying kind of what we said earlier, that God is our shadow, that whatever, just like a shadow, whatever we do is essentially what happens in the heavens. And therefore, through us being happy, through us being in a positive attitude, because obviously following the Yom Kippur War was still the month of Tishrei. It's a couple of days before Sukkot, and it's a time of joy. It's the time that we're supposed to be joyous. So through the joy that we're supposed to have in this time, that itself will reflect what is going on in heaven, and this joy will break all the boundaries of what the Jewish people are experiencing in the land of Israel. So to boil it down, we have a couple things we can learn from this. Number one is we have to think positive. We can't be, reading the news and negative things and causing ourselves anguish of what's going on, constantly being just, fully involved in all the negativity that's going on in the world. That's number one. We have to be, and again, this isn't just something that is a psychological exercise for our own mental health, but this is also something that affects the reality, that we see clearly that from all that we spoke about tonight, that this affects the reality of what's going on in the land of Israel and in all around the world for all the Jewish people. And number two is that we have to be careful not to speak negatively as well. We saw what happens when Moses spoke ill about the Jewish people, about another Jew, even somebody who wasn't good. It ended up affecting his situation, that he had to flee. So we see here that it's number one is to think positive and not to think negative, and not to speak negative, not about another Jew, not about politicians in Israel, and not about this person, that person, he should have done this, and we have to think positively, we have to speak positively, and that itself will give us and give the Jewish people the power to overcome all the things that are going on in the world. And God should help us to, through our positive thoughts, through our positive actions, that itself will bring the redemption to the Jewish people, and the ultimate redemption with the coming of Mashiach. I want to wish everybody a good Shabbos, and God willing, we will see you next week.